Welcome to Econ 102, where economist Noah Smith and I make sense of what's happening in the news, technology, business, and beyond through the lens of economics. Let's jump right in. I thought we'd bring Itay on because I think he has an interesting perspective on the economy that differs in some ways from Noah's, but is complementary and might help our audience get smarter in understanding what's going on. So we're here to have a discussion, but also to educate our audience a bit and go a bit deeper. Maybe we could start with Noah, maybe just doing a rehashing on why we should be a little bit optimistic in the U.S. about how the economy's looking, how it's performed, and what to look forward to in terms of the sort of underlying numbers and fundamentals of the economy.
Well, so I mean, it's very hard to find economic numbers that are bad. Things that are bad about the economy right now. Everybody who wants a job has a job. We sort of to the point where we used to complain about how hard it was to get a job, and now we've sort of forgotten that and almost just assumed that job is the natural state of the world for everybody. And the last time that happened, well, I guess, to some degree in like 2019, but then really then like the late 90s, it was the last time we thought, oh, job is just something you can just get if you want. Because except for, the brief interruption of COVID, we've had high employment for a long time now. And of course, we had high inflation for a couple of years, but that has pretty much come down. Inflation is, by most measures, back pretty much to a like normal, what we think of as a normal low level, and so then asset prices are up. So if you're in the stock market, you've made some good money. Your house prices are decent. They're kind of flat, but yeah. So if you look at people's wealth overall, people have been paying down their debts. We do this survey of consumer finances where they go around and ask like a bunch of people about their finances, and people have money in their checking accounts more than they used to. They're paying down their debts more than they used to. They've got lower credit card debt payments, and despite high interest rates, and people are financially healthier. And so it's pretty hard to see ways in which the economy is doing bad. Like there'll always be somebody who says the economy is doing bad because, of course we have bad news about, political stuff and protests in the streets and fights over DEI or whatever. And so there's this national unrest. So there's always this urge, I think, people want to put this into material terms. People want to say, well, the economy's bad. But honestly, it's not. And it's getting just really harder and harder to find some economic statistics that suggest that the economy is bad. How's that for opening statement?
It's great. Itay, why don't you jump in and see say how you see things from your perspective?
Right. So I don't fully disagree with Noah regarding how the economy has done or has so far handled kind of the rate shock or some of the inflationary shock. I think where we disagree is that I don't necessarily take what has recently happened as evidence of what is going to happen. So we have a variety of tools which we look at, a little bit over 10 points that we focus on leading indicators and leading data. By the way, I would argue that some things are very bad, like manufacturing data and some of the other things that have been in deep contraction, which are potentially leading indicators to what the economy may do. So my entire focus as a money manager is focusing on what we believe the next 12 to 18 months are going to look like. And the key here is that there has been a long and variable lag between how monetary policy has historically influenced the economy than what is currently visible. So, if you look at headlines from mid-2007 or even mid-2008, 2000, and even going back into the 90s, it's very common that people say, the economy is just fine and the Fed was able to pull it off. I've seen a recent article literally from August 2007 saying something very similar. So it doesn't necessarily take into effect what can happen and what's going to happen when some of these refinancing are going to come in and when the actual influence of high rates is going to be felt. And I'm happy to dive into some of these specifics of why we believe that a recession is actually very likely.
Please do, Itay. Yeah, flesh it out.
Sure. So Noah, you started with employment. You discussed, everybody that wants to have a job has a job, etc. I don't disagree with that the labor market has been, I think, one of the tightest, if not the tightest in history. And we have to keep in mind that there's been a massive wall of money that was created post-COVID that we're still, somewhat going through. So looking back into employment numbers, what we're looking for versus the underlying actual NFP numbers, which there's been some issues with them. There's been a pretty big discrepancy between things like payroll and actual employment that throughout the past year. But even if you take that out of account, it's the rate of change, and the rate of change has been getting worse. So both opening jobs as far as JOLTS has been decelerating recently, which leads us to somewhat of an increase in the unemployment rate. So historically speaking, when the unemployment rises more than 0.5% from its average 12 months, in the post-war period, that's always meant a recession. And usually a recession comes in when you're at about 0.2 and rising. Right now, the situation is around 0.3, so we're not quite at a threshold, but that has been rising. There's also the leading employment index. So if you're looking at the confidence board, that's a part of the leading economic indicators. It's actually been negative for 12 straight months. So, the soft landing argument is that we had too tight of a labor market and, we're actually going kind of towards normalization. My argument is that it's very difficult to predict when that actually happens, because once unemployment starts picking up, historically speaking, when you get to these thresholds, they continue to accelerate, and it's very difficult to know ahead of time that that's actually going to stop. So we do see evidence of the labor market deteriorating, so it's going to be interesting to see where it's going to go. Regarding inflation, we're under the assumption that inflation is primarily a monetary phenomena. I know there is clearly, supply chains and things like that. But there's been a really good lead with the growth of M2 money supply and how inflation looks 12 months forward. M2 money supply is collapsing at some of the fastest rates in history. Historically, that also meant a recession at the price of getting inflation back down towards target. I would argue that it's actually not a target, being at mid threes, with course being potentially sticky. So it's still TBD to see if it can come down very quickly this year. I'm actually in the camp that it does. But as it does, it probably triggers a recession as well, as it would come down a little bit quicker. There's actually a bunch of more points to cover when it comes to that, and I don't want to get into too much of a monologue. So I want to see if there's any comment from Noah, and if not, we can take it to some of the other indicators.
Yeah, so that's interesting. If you're talking about whether a recession is going to happen, which is what you're talking about, that's always a lot harder than assessing the current health and state of the economy right now. Like a forecast is much harder than a nowcast, and the best forecasting methods in the world for macroeconomic stuff are very, very inaccurate. So I used to know a guy at Renaissance Technologies who would always say that all financially useful data costs money. That's why macro data is free. And so, macro stuff is very, very hard to trade on. Maybe Ray Dalio can do it, but he's not telling us his secrets. Anyway, forecasting, there's lots of studies of forecasting methods, surveys of private forecasters and blah, 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 more rigorous models. They're all pretty bad at forecasting recessions. And, they all tend to forecast a whole bunch of recessions that don't happen and to miss the recessions that do happen. And so our watchers and listeners should take this with a grain of salt. Everything we talk about when we're talking about how the economy might do 6 months from now, a year from now, especially a year from now, is just a lot of guesswork. And people shouldn't think that there's some kind of science where we see all this stuff coming ahead of time. This is something money managers and private sector macro people will just argue with back and forth, and then academic economists won't even comment on, and Fed people would if they were allowed to comment on, but they're not. Anyway, so I guess that's a long preamble of saying, from when we're talking about the future, you shouldn't trust anything we say. But okay, so employment, the labor market has weakened a little bit in the last couple months, but employment is not a leading indicator. Employment is typically a lagging indicator. It's typically the last thing to respond. So the fact that the other stuff seems to be doing pretty well, growth seems to be doing really well on all this stuff, tells me that the weakening of the labor market is not a harbinger of recession necessarily, because because the other stuff, we would expect it to follow the other stuff instead of to lead it. It's not really a leading indicator. In terms of manufacturing stuff, that is more of a leading indicator for sure. But what's interesting is that factory construction continues to boom. And if you look at, how much American companies are investing in building new factories in America, or even foreign companies investing in building new factories in America, you see that it's at highs that it hasn't been for our lifetimes. It is, when I say highs, I don't mean in nominal terms. I mean in inflation adjusted terms. Once you adjust for the cost of building new factories, factory construction is at this legendary high right now. And so, of course, some of that is due to policy. Some of that's due to industrial policy, right? Obviously. But you figure that if these companies didn't, they can't live on subsidies alone, right? If they didn't expect some kind of demand to be coming, they wouldn't be building factories at such an incredible rate as they are now. So that's a sign of optimism on their part, whether or not that optimism is justified, right? Remember, once again, we're reading tea leaves. We're trying to say, okay, the people who make factories must be optimistic because they're building a bunch of factories. And so maybe they have some information we don't about the state of the economy at the ground level. And then the third thing is about the Fed and rates. As for whether or not the Fed rate hikes have had time to affect the economy, that's a complex and very interesting question. So I think that the best argument for recession is that a long, protracted period of high interest rates will eventually break something in the financial markets. And that, especially, I think the most likely thing that will break is commercial property. Because that's also being hit by the rise of remote work. So we're seeing, no one wants to go back to the office. I mean, some people are going back, but no one wants to. And so, remote work has plateaued at a much higher level than it was pre-pandemic. And, in addition, all the commercial property developers are highly, highly leveraged. And so when you're highly leveraged, you have to roll over your debt. And when you have to roll over your debt at higher interest rates, that kills your business because there's not a lot of margin for error in that business. So when interest rates go up, a lot of property developers can vaporize. Private housing developers are doing all right because housing prices rose. There's still pretty robust demand. Millennials buying their own houses, but commercial property could be in big trouble. And I think that the best argument for, if you're saying what will cause a recession, I think the best argument is that a long protracted period of high interest rates will cause the commercial property market to go bust, which will cause banks to become weaker because suddenly all the money that they lent to commercial property developers is now not coming back, right? Those are bad loans on their books. And then they will pull back lending to the rest of the economy. The financial channel of lending will get weaker, and then, borrowing costs will get higher. And so businesses all across America will not be able to borrow. They will not expand. They will not hire, blah, blah, blah. And that's the kind of most likely recession story, I think, right now. And so I do think that this is definitely a worry. I don't think we've seen this manifest yet. I think when you look at some of the numbers of quote unquote zombie companies that aren't able to cover their interest payments, except by borrowing more, you do see an uncomfortably high number of those. Those are probably concentrated in the property sector. But then I don't think so this is a way that a recession could happen. I don't think we'll go an infinite amount of time without a recession. I think we will have a recession again sometime. And if you ask me what's the likeliest thing to cause it that we can see right now, I mean, maybe it'll be some big shock, some, massive oil price spike, some sort of, thing like that. But I think that in terms of things we can see coming down the pipe or pike, I'm not actually sure what that expression is right now. I think that long period of high interest rates leading to pain in the commercial property sector is probably the thing I'm most scared of.
Hey, everybody. Erik here with a word from our sponsors. Have you ever wondered where your donation could have the most impact? In 2007, a group of donors had that exact question. But when they sought out information from charities to help them answer this question, they instead received cute pictures or unhelpful stories. Their experience led them to create GIVEWELL, an organization providing rigorous, transparent research about the best giving opportunities they've found. GIVEWELL has now spent over 15 years researching charitable organizations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities they've found in global health and poverty alleviation. Over 100,000 donors have used GIVEWELL to donate more than $1 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 150,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. GIVEWELL wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high-impact giving. You can find all of their research and recommendations on their site for free. You can make tax-deductible donations to their recommended funds or charities, and GIVEWELL doesn't take a cut. If you've never donated through GIVEWELL before, you can have your donation matched up to $100 before the end of the year, or as long as matching funds last. To claim your match, go to givewell.org, pick podcast, and enter Econ 102 at checkout. Make sure they know that you heard about GIVEWELL from Econ 102 to get your donation matched. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more.
What do you think?
Right. So you said a few things. I actually agree with you about a lot of it. Completely, obviously, employment is definitely a lagging indicator. I would argue the housing market is actually in trouble across the board because even with normal residential housing, millennials and such, you're seeing one of the lowest transaction volumes in decades, right? Like mortgage applications are down massively over the last couple of years. So the housing market, I would argue, has definitely cooled. I live in Austin, where you see home prices are actually starting to go down quite quickly over the last few months. But that's kind of besides the point.
Boo.
I think the main boo, right? It's okay. I bought it in 2019, so I'm still doing okay. I think there's actually talking about pro forecast, and
I'm a big Austin booster. I think Austin is the future.
I would agree with you. I moved here from California before the pandemic, right, to express a real estate thesis, honestly. So it worked pretty well. But I would argue, on the macro front, there are two things that have historically worked very well in predicting recessions, despite obviously it's very difficult to read the tea leaves, what have you, especially when it comes to the exact timing. But those two things are really the yield curves, which we have one of the most prolonged inverted yield curve periods and one of the steepest ones in the post-war period. And particularly when you're looking at the 3-month by 10-year yield curve, when you're starting to disinvert from where you were, the countdown for recession is, pretty imminent. Like I would say within the next 12 months or so, that's typically when that happens. And we're seeing that type of disinversion now, and typically that leads unemployment as well. Now, the second one is the depth of contraction for LEIs, leading economic indicators, which we discussed. Obviously, employment's not one of them, but we have a variety of them. And there's never been a time in the post-war period where leading economic indicators, which manufacturing is one of them, dropped more than the 4.5% threshold, and we do not trigger a recession. Leading economic indicators now have been contracting for 20 months straight and are at negative 7.5%. That worries me a lot. Only 1974 and 2008 exceeded that period. And when you have a combination of the yield curve inversion and you have LEIs at this type of contraction, again, this could be the first time this doesn't happen, but it's never been a period that those indicators signal that type of recession, and it did not happen. Now, if for some reason the economy stays afloat, the yield curve disinverts, and LEIs go back into expansion, and we do not experience a recession, that would actually be the first false negative that they've contributed. So these are the kind of things that we track, and we realize the risk of recession is quite high. The way it happens is, I agree with you that that's a likely scenario, particularly with zombie companies, if rates stay higher, if we get stagflation, et cetera. But it's difficult to predict what the cause will actually be or what the excuse will be. Could be some kind of shock, could be geopolitical, could be something else. It's very difficult to see up front, but we'll obviously know in hindsight when it happens. But it's almost like the way I like to think about it is we can go into a room and see that it's full of gunpowder. We don't know what's going to cause the fire. So when I go into the room right now, I believe that it's full of gunpowder, given the set of leading indicators that is telling us that things could be rough, particularly given high valuation, things like that. Regarding the kind of factory reshoring, I think that's a part of a bigger theme of just nearshoring, reshoring, given this deglobalization trend that we're seeing. I think that could be a big part of it. We just saw Mexico exceeding China as the largest importer, which is a really big news. So, friendshoring, nearshoring, whatever you want to call it, I think it has a big impact, but also government spending, right? If the government's currently running the largest deficit outside of war pandemic period in history, I don't think that's sustainable. And it's running a massive deficit to GDP, and it's continuing to do so into a very high interest rate environment. A big part of the GDP boost we've seen and the reason things are being afloat, I believe, has something to do with that. So these are just telling you that if we do get a period of inflation that's higher, by the way, nearshoring would contribute to higher inflation structurally. So if you do see some of these things that lead to higher for longer with this level of government spending, the number of risk factors is just substantial. And you could argue that the economy has kind of been artificially kept there afloat due to all this fiscal spending.
Well, maybe. I think that if you saw the economy kept afloat due to fiscal spending, you'd see that manifest in inflation, because you did really see that during COVID and after COVID. And in 2021, you certainly saw this. But, the mechanism for the fiscal spending keeping the economy afloat is for the government to spend a bunch of money, and then people take that money and go out and spend it. And, prices of things get pushed up. But prices of things are not getting pushed up. We're still seeing inflation, come down. Like it's still, we still are in this deflationary sort of, looking situation. Not deflationary, disinflationary, which means inflation is still positive, obviously, but it is coming down, from where it was. I think that if we were seeing, we've had fairly big government deficits over the last year. Over all of 2023, we saw that. It's not a new thing. And I think that if you saw, if the economy was being kept afloat by fiscal stimulus, you would definitely see, you'd see inflation from that. Instead, we're seeing the opposite of that. Now, of course, the Treasury, the federal government, fiscal policy isn't the only thing that affects inflation. We got monetary policy too. So exactly, we got the Fed, and so if the in a very simple sort of like hydraulic model, we just imagine aggregate demand as like water that you pump in and take out of the economy, right? Like in the 1950s, people loved this sort of thinking about the economy this way. So if you pump water in with federal deficits and you take it out via, burning money, essentially, higher interest rates, et cetera, which is, you talked about thinking about the monetary view of things and M2 coming down. That's exactly that. Then those things will cancel out. And so I think that the fiscal tightening, loose fiscal policy and tight monetary policy will act against each other and have been canceling each other out to some degree. I think that tight and this may have been exactly the recipe we needed to get the disinflationary boom. I'm kind of mildly annoyed at how few people recognize how amazing it is to get a disinflationary boom. There's no situation that we've ever had before when inflation has come down like this without a recession. Like when I say a recession, I don't mean a recession that eventually happens, because if you on a long enough time horizon, you will have a recession someday. What I mean is that the way it's supposed to work is that you cut, you raise interest rates or maybe cut deficits, but usually just raise interest rates. That makes people spend less. It makes it harder for businesses to borrow. They stop borrowing, they stop hiring, people stop shopping, blah, blah. The economy gets hurt, and that brings down inflation. And when you look at the 1980s, the early 1980s, when Paul Volcker raised interest rates to defeat the 70s inflation, and you saw exactly this happening. Textbook, you saw the Rust Belt, you saw companies just apocalypse, and then people stopped spending, and then inflation came down, and then it's eventually stayed down. But this time you didn't have to have that, and this is pretty amazing. So many of us thought that would have to happen. I thought that would have to happen. I didn't think it would have to be, I didn't think it was going to be like 80s level, but I thought that we'd get some sort of like at least small recession out of raising interest rates before the inflation came down, right? The lack of spending, lack of demand is what's supposed to drive the prices down. Instead, we got the prices, the inflation coming down, and in some cases, prices actually going down, like, oil and gas. We got that to come down without a loss of consumer spending. Consumer spending held up, and that's kind of amazing. And that's kind of amazing that we were able to do that. Of course, we got some help from the fact that, oil prices came back down somewhat, and that, all this time, like, shipping was becoming easier, blah, 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 blah. And so we got help, right? But at the same time, this can't have been the whole story. Our government did a really good job there. Anyway, end rant. But in terms of whether we're getting a recession coming year, I know that there's massive lists of leading and lagging indicators. But one problem is that it's sort of like out of sample predictions are really hard. And, before COVID, I spent a lot of time writing for Bloomberg about how we were likely to get at least a small recession given yield curve inversion. I've read all the papers on yield curve inversion. I know that it's typically one of the better leading indicators. And we did with or without COVID, we got it around that time. Not in the time horizon predicted. We were supposed to get a recession in 2019 from that yield curve inversion, given the lags that we had seen in previous recessions from the yield curve inversion. We didn't. We got a technical recession from COVID a year later, right? But yield curve inverted, and it didn't seem to do anything. And then it uninverted, and that didn't seem to do anything. And so, the yield curve inversion is a good macroeconomic good leading indicator as leading indicators go, right? But that's like saying, yeah, I don't know. Like, anyway, it's not a very good. There's no indicators that are really great. The lead, the yield curve inverts, and then recessions don't happen. Sometimes that happens.
That only happened, I believe, twice. It's happened
a number of times.
And look at the 3 months by 10 years, not the 2 by 10. 3 months by 10 is more accurate.
Okay, but remember, that's not necessarily what we would have said, back in 2016, because the 2 by 10 was what everyone was talking about back then. The point being that one of these indicators has held up better than the others, given our more recent data points. That's, there's only a few data points here. We're really, we're running a regression with 5 data points. Like, I can tell you that's not going to give you a large sample.
11, but yeah.
Yeah, no, there's 11 data points. That's right. There, it's very easy to overfit to 11 data points, right? I don't know, like, if you're in the audience, overfitting means that, like, you observe some complex pattern from just a couple of data points, and then you project that out. And of course, you're just over extrapolating from those few data points. So if you're in the audience, you don't know what overfitting is, you can just Google it, Google image search overfitting, and it will show you a silly little picture that displays what that is. But then, of course, if you're in the audience and you do like machine learning, you obviously know about it, and people are yelling at you all day about it, and you're like, God, I know about overfitting, shut up. Anyway, so gotta always think about, like, who we're talking to here. But okay, so
it's kind of like every recession had a yield curve inversion ahead of it, but not every yield curve inversion leads to a recession.
More or less. That's pretty true.
Hey everybody, Erik here with a word from our sponsors. If you're a startup founder or executive running a growing business, you know that as you scale, your systems break down and the cracks start to show. If this resonates with you, there are 3 numbers you need to know: 36,000, 25, and 1. 36,000. That's the number of businesses which have upgraded to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite is the #1 cloud financial system, streamline accounting, financial management, inventory, HR, and more. 25. NetSuite turns 25 this year. That's 25 years of helping businesses do more with less, close their books in days, not weeks, and drive down costs. One, because your business is one of a kind, so you get a customized solution for all your KPIs in one efficient system with one source of truth. Manage risk, get reliable forecasts, and improve margins. Everything you need all in one place. Right now, download NetSuite's popular KPI checklist, designed to give you consistently excellent performance, absolutely free, at netsuite.com/102. netsuite.com/102 to get your own KPI checklist. netsuite.com/102.
I would say that, so when people at the Fed, economists at the Fed look at this, they think the yield curve is the second best leading indicator.
I agree with that.
What would you say is the best? I want to hear what you say is the best.
I believe that the combination of LEIs, rate of change in employment, plus yield curve inversion has been the best indicator in combination.
Okay. Oh, interesting.
I don't think there's a perfect indicator, but I think there is a variety of indicators that if they all agree on something, it just increases its probability. There's, the way I think about things is just in terms of probabilities, right? Like nothing is obviously guaranteed, but it just increases the probability of an event happening if there's a variety of these things happening.
Right.
And to your point, having zombie companies, etc., just keeps kind of increasing its probability. Regarding, I think what you said something very interesting, that fiscal and monetary policy kind of counter each other out in 2023. I would argue that the Fed's program that was set up post the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, that allowed the banking sector to basically offload their bad debt and get liquidity during that period of time, was a version of stealth QE that happened last year. And it increased liquidity in the system. So if you look at overall reserves, Treasury General Account, all those things, we have a liquidity model. Liquidity actually increased last year because of all these programs. That program is set to expire in March. I would argue the Fed would probably either end QT or extend this program, because we'll be in a lot of trouble if they don't. So to that point, I still believe liquidity was increasing last year. I believe there was more inflow than net outflow, which is one of the reasons I think spending has held up.
Could be, but so that is interesting. If we saw a shit ton of liquidity being pumped into the system at the same time as the federal government was running a big deficit, and that was keeping the economy on like a sugar high or whatever you want to call it, or like, just pumping up demand, right? We'd see inflation. We'd see inflation accelerate. We didn't see inflation accelerate. That didn't happen. Inflation came down in 2023. It came down a lot. That's what tells me that what we're seeing is not primarily just an economy kept afloat by monetary and fiscal policy, because that would have caused inflation.
So why didn't we see inflation post 0809 when the Fed reinstituted QE programs?
Because the banking system was dead. The banking system was destroyed.
I would argue that it wasn't dead in 2018 or 2019, right? It was dead at the very beginning, but we've had QE. We had QE forever in 2013, 2014. We've had QE so many times. We had 85 billion a month of money printing. We had zero rates for such a long period of time. We really only saw inflation pick up after COVID, because we had a massive combination of monetary and fiscal policy combined to a really high degree. Because I would argue that there is a demographic aspect to inflation that we don't have today. That's the biggest difference between now and the 1970s and 80s, because we actually have a very low birth rate. And demographically speaking, the kind of like organic demand to push inflation is not here.
So if you look at the period, so you talked about thinking about these things in a monetary way, right? You think about inflation as a monetary phenomenon, and you talk about massive money printing after the Great Recession. If you look at a graph of M2, the broad money, monetary base, or broad money supply, the broad money supply is M2. If you look at M2, it doesn't really go up at all. It doesn't accelerate. It just grows at the same steady, slow rate after the Great Recession. In COVID, it absolutely explodes, and then you saw inflation. So the old monetarists who just looked at M2 true. And said, well, okay, you printed money, we're going to get inflation, are kind of winning here. They're winning. And if you look at the period in 08, 09 or 10 and 11, when we kept doing QE, you see that someone was canceling the Fed out. And that someone was private banks, because what was happening was the Fed was printing all this money and banks were taking the money and putting it in a vault. Now, of course, we both know that's not exactly what happened. It was actually just items in a spreadsheet and the run up of reserves and blah, 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 blah. But what metaphorically, in the textbook metaphor, we printed a bunch of money and banks stuck it in a vault and did nothing with it. And so that's why the actual amount of money in circulation didn't increase. And that's why we printed all that money and we didn't get inflation. In COVID, we printed all the money and it did circulate, right? It got lent out to everybody and it got spent and spent and spent. And then after COVID, we got the inflation.
I agree. They're basically a recapitalization of the banking system because that's effectively what they were. The banking system went broke, and then QE programs were kind of a recapitalization of the banking system. I fully believe that inflation is somewhat of a monetary phenomena, but you're saying inflation is coming out. Inflation is 100% coming down, but a lot of it has to do with the base effect. We're still over 3%. I think the last mile is going to be very difficult given this like counter globalization trends we're seeing and other things like that. But it's not the same, right? Like post 2020, 21, when we saw this massive demand boost and this wall of money created, 30 cents of every dollar has been basically printed out. It was a combination of fiscal and monetary policy. And then we got this initial rush. And then obviously the disinflation period, fully agree, there's a big lead to M2 kind of money supply. But that doesn't mean that, it's this immaculate disinflation. It's just because we had a massive wall of money that was created that is basically unprecedented in modern economics, right? The amount of money that was just created in this type of way out of thin air, but it doesn't change the fact that demographically, I still think that the long-term trends are deflationary. They're more Japan-like than anything else.
I agree with that. So in terms of the long-term trend pushing toward deflation, of course, productivity growth matters, trade will matter. There's a bunch of other stuff, but I think demographically, you're absolutely right. Although I will say that attempts to predict inflation using demographics have been very frustrating in the past because we don't, the effect is kind of complex. But anyway, but I agree. I think that right now, what we're seeing is that policy isn't doing a hell of a lot because we've seen the money supply kind of going down, but fiscal deficits are still pretty big. I don't see a big push from policy in either direction. If you look at the housing market, so what's interesting is that before the Great Recession, housing was and even during the Great Recession, housing was the entire business cycle. Like housing, there's a couple papers by Ed Leamer on this, which are really good. Housing basically is the most interest rate sensitive part of the economy. It's, this big durable thing that we can either build or not build it. It's subject to these big boom bust cycles.
Agreed. And
so housing really was the economy. If you look at housing now, you see housing starts have not cratered. You told me about how no one's building new housing, but they are. In fact, people are building new housing starts in November of 2023.
They're building them, but they're not buying them.
Right. And so maybe we're going to build a whole bunch of houses that nobody's going to want to buy.
Seems that way.
But I don't know. I mean, basically we have to say that it's some sort of malinvestment, blah, blah. Maybe all the people, so the thing is that a lot of economic indicators are based on expectations. So the yield curve is based on expectations, right? If you're talking about using the yield curve to forecast stuff, the yield curve, for those who don't know, is the difference between short-term and long-term interest rates. That's really what we're talking about here. We're talking about the term spread of interest rates. And if you look, long-term interest rates depend on the bets of bond traders. That depends on the market expectations. So if we believe that markets are reasonably good or very good forecasters of future economic activity, we sort of need to believe that the yield curve is a good indicator. And yet, if we believe that, then we also look at housing starts and manufacturing and factory construction, and we say, okay, well, on the other hand, these people are all optimistic. So maybe all the people building factories are dumb and there won't be any demand for their new factories' products and their factories will go bust and it'll be a big bust. And maybe all the people building new houses are dumb and there'll be no demand for the new houses and they'll go bust. And maybe the bond traders are smart and that's why the yield curve is inverted. Do we really think that all the people building all the factories and the houses are dumb and that the bond traders are smart? Why don't some of the bond traders go arbitrage and work in the home building and factory building industry if there's so much stupidity in those industries and people are being so dumb. So anyway, I don't know. That's a probably a stupid economic argument, but I guess the point is that there's lots of people who are behaving as if they have massive confidence.
Well, how much of it is actually planned in advance, right, during the low interest rate period of time? Because I know a lot of these housing projects, one of the things I look at is the architectural billing index. So I think it's a really interesting leading indicator on the housing market because you can see how many hours architects were billed for. And that tends to lead housing starts. So take in mind that there's sometimes a 2 to 5 year lead time when it comes down to all these kind of housing starts, because it's not like you're getting permits to build and then you build it the next day. So, to me, that's pretty lagging of an indicator when it comes to that. Maybe in 2 years, it would be kind of following the yield curve. I think more of a actual transaction volume of what's happening in the housing market is a better indicator of, actual demand for housing.
Maybe, but then I think that we did see a dip in housing starts. We saw a dip that's now coming back, and I think that how many houses are bought is going to be a lagging indicator compared to how many houses are built, because houses are built before they are bought, unlike in China where houses are bought before they are built. But then houses in America are built before they're bought, and generally speaking. And so I think that we did see a dip when in 2022 we saw a dip, and I think that low transaction volumes now are probably downstream of that. But then what we see now is we see rising real incomes. As inflation has gone down, the natural sort of nominal wage increases that everybody's getting and other income increases are translating into real income increases. So real incomes going back up, real wages going back up. That is going to increase confidence and I think increase demand for housing. And I think that the fact that housing starts have held up well is probably at least partially due to property developers saying, okay, people are going to want some housing. There's also structural demand for housing because work from home requires that you have a space in your home to work. And so I think that a lot of the decrease in demand for commercial property will result in a concomitant, I really love the word concomitant. It'll result in an increase in demand for residential property because people will be doing home offices, right? They'll be switching from working outside to like working inside, and they're going to want more inside. And so they're going to want bigger houses, and stuff like that. And so I think that that's going to add demand as well. And so I think that the people building, if I had to guess, I'd say that the people building sort of anticipate that improvement, that robust demand from like work from home for residential property. But I don't really know. I just go by like some housing finance blogs that I read, and they say like things are not bad right now.
How do you follow the unaffordability issue though? Because the biggest issue in housing is that it's generally, I think it's one of the most unaffordable housing markets in history now because rates are as high as they are and prices haven't corrected nearly as much, which because so many people are actually locked in, it's much below market rates. I think I read somewhere the average rate is 3.1, 3.2%. The mortgage rates today are 6.5%, 7%. So it's a massively unaffordable market, and still people won't move until rates come down. So what's interesting is that in historical cycles, the last two really, the markets took, the market only started going lower when the Fed actually started cutting rates, both in 2008. When the Fed started cutting rates was when equities in both housing started dropping substantially, and also in 2000. So in a weird way, I feel like lower rates would release a lot of housing inventory because people are stuck now and they don't want to move.
Yeah.
So in kind of that weird way, that's very counterintuitive. If we do get lower rates, I do think it's going to release a lot of inventory and could pressure prices lower, which could really hit the wealth effect that I think you're referring to, which what makes people feel wealthy and what makes them spend a bunch of money.
Right. The thing about housing is that, and we talk about this in the context of like the YIMBY-NIMBY battles a lot, but the fundamental fact of housing is that what's good for homeowners is bad for home buyers.
Yeah.
So if you're looking to tell a negative story about the economy, or a positive story, you can always find something in the housing market. If house prices, go up, You can say, well, things are great because people are feeling wealthier, or you can say things are terrible because houses are less affordable. And this is going to crater transaction volumes and real economic activity. And if housing prices go down, you can say, well, this is great because now people are going to buy and buy. And then, we're going to see real economic activity go up, but you're going to say, oh, it's bad because wealth effect is going to go down. So people are going to spend less on other stuff. So that the housing prices themselves, you can spin a story very easily to go either way, no matter which way the prices are going. Or prices or monthly mortgage payments, affordability of monthly mortgage payments, so it's worked the same way. I mean, you can spin a story either way.
Right, but if housing prices go negative historically, like generally you would get a bad economy. So I do understand what you're saying, but I think it's, if housing does go negative in a big way, it does impact the economy, where kind of like gradual, slow increases have been kind of the positive. What would cause that Goldilocks type of scenario?
I agree. That is what we want to see. But in the second half of 2022, we saw housing prices go down. We saw an actual drop in housing prices.
Very marginal.
Did the economy suffer from this as it would have in the past? No. Yeah. Well, very marginal. I mean, like that's a decent sized drop. That was the biggest drop since the 2007 crash, and it was bigger than any other drop on record except for the 2007 crash. That was a big drop. It was not the biggest drop. It's not 2008, right? It's not the apocalypse, but it was a hefty drop. It was,
a 10% correction.
Yeah, but the point is that's like a big deal. That historically speaking, that's a big drop. Like historically speaking, houses almost never have that kind of correction. Like you see that kind of correction in the stock market. You don't see that kind of correction in the housing market. Like that's nationwide. That's big. You see that kind of correction in some local housing markets sometimes, but not nation.
Well, I think you've never seen this type of appreciation like what we saw between 2020 and 2021. That type of jump in housing prices was basically unprecedented, right?
Really, you saw more appreciation than that before the big housing bust of 2007 and you didn't see that big of a crash. But you did see a decrease. That was pretty if you look at, I mean, it depends on what rate you look at, but if you look at the sort of monthly rates of change or the 6-month rates of change, this was like a bigger drop in housing prices in 2022 than we'd seen. There was no recession. The economy is fine. And so I'm not so worried about that.
Right. My argument though is that people didn't really feel that. The appreciation was just so quick and so extreme in 2020 2021. So like that type of correction wasn't that felt by that many. But I do agree in 2022, the wealth effect did obviously suffer because of both housing and the stock market have fallen that year. But that year, I mean, you had a technical recession, but you didn't have a real recession. I would agree with you.
So the one indicator, by the way, I never got to say what the magic indicator from the economist's perspective was, and I kind of wanted to say this, which is the share of risky debt. So the share of risky debt in total borrowing turns out to be, in several economics papers, they said this is the best leading indicator, better than the yield curve, although the yield curve adds information. So basically the yield curve is predictions about the Fed, while risky debt is predictions about the financial system independent of the Fed. That's, I think, an easy way to think of it. And so the share of risky debt recently has not really gone up a ton. I think that we don't see a lot of crazy borrowers borrowing. I think the risk that we're not seeing a borrowing mania. We sort of did during like 2020, 2021, given all the money that the Fed had pumped into the economy and all the lending programs and blah, blah, blah.
Why would you see a borrowing mania when rates have already risen, right? So like it's expensive to borrow now, but everybody borrowed when they could, when rates were cheaper.
That's right. So the scary story that we're telling about a possible recession, which I agree is always possible, like recession is possible. I'm not ruling it out. I'm not saying, ha, 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 the economy looks so strong today. You'll never dethrone us. We will reign for 1,000 years. No, that's not how it works. Recessions can come at any time. All of our forecasting methods are terrible. When we say something's a good forecasting method, we mean it like, it has like an R squared of like 0.1, right? Like you look at the R squared of these things, it's just insanely bad. And so like all these things are bad, but then basically the recession story that we're going to have to tell in order to have a recession is not people are now doing crazy shit that is about to crash, right? It's going to have to be people did crazy shit a long time ago that got frozen into the system and that now much later are going to crash as a result from interest rates staying high enough for long enough. I think that's the story we have to tell to make ourselves believe in a recession.
I mean, that's classic malinvestment because rates were lower than they should have been and money was too easy to get.
Right. And so, but it has to be, we have to have a couple things that are kind of unusual work for that story to work, which is number one, the crappy investments have to last very long, right? They have to last a long time. So often, in 2007, the Fed raised interest rates a little bit and suddenly this whole house of cards just came crashing down, right? It didn't take very long to crash that whole house of cards back in 2007 and 8. But now, what we'd have to look at commercial property, especially.
Well, it went from rates went from 2% to 5%.
That's not a huge change, and it didn't take long. Maybe, but people were just over leveraged. Like how substantial a rate changes depends entirely on how much leverage there is in the system.
I mean, they started raising rates in 2004 and they only ended it in 2007. So it was a pretty, it did take some time. I would argue that the popping of the dot-com bubble is what enabled the housing market to begin with, right? Because that's initially when they got to pretty low rates.
For sure. But and not just rates either, but just sort of a portfolio reallocation rotation. But yeah, I think that's absolutely right. But then what I'm saying is that for the recession story now to make sense, with these indicators we're talking about, we've got to see people doing a lot of risky stuff in the past that survived till now and hasn't blown up despite now, over a year of high interest rates and, a much bigger rate hike than we saw from 2% to 5% in the 2000s. This is a much bigger and much faster interest rate hike that we've seen now.
I agree.
And yet for all this stuff to not have collapsed yet and then reach some threshold where it all collapses, that would be unusual. I'm saying this is our story. This is our scary story we're sort of telling about how a recession might come soon. And I agree that the story is possible, but historically speaking, it would be kind of weird for it to shake out that way. And I guess every recession is different, so every recession is a bit weird. But yeah, I think that's what we're looking at.
Every time's a little bit different. If the Fed, for example, haven't stepped in and allowed all this excess liquidity to the banking system in March, I think we would already have been in a very bad recession, right? But potentially, I think they only kicked the can down the road because there are still a variety of bad investments, loans, and other things that have happened, especially across smaller companies that we don't see, some of those credit spreads and things like that. One of the things that I think is quite interesting, speaking of all this type of reallocation of capital, to your point, is the amount of zombie companies, the amount of refinancing that has to happen. So while very large companies are actually playing the yield curve in reverse because they're able to lock in a ton of debt 2020 and 2021 for very low rates, and what they're doing right now is they're putting it in short-term treasuries, making a lot of money. Even Apple itself, sitting on so much cash, is able to massively benefit from that. So in a weird way, I believe that when rates go lower, you're going to see a lot of that effect releasing itself into the system. Not necessarily when it's, sure, the longer it stays higher, the more risk is built into the system. But then that popping moment happens when actually rates go lower and then enable all that supply from a variety of different places.
That's a long and complex chain of causality. And I think that
it did.
Historically, the reason rates have lagged, a lot of these indicators, and the reason rates were cut in the past it wasn't that, rates were high and then we cut rates and then that released a bunch of stuff that released increased supply that depressed prices that then caused a recession via wealth effects. I don't think that's ever happened ever. I think that what we saw in the past was that rates got cut because the economy was doing worse. So the rates were lagging. Rates lagged. And so the rate cuts came in response to economic weakness instead of ahead of, of course, economic.
Well, monetary always lags, right?
Let's get some last statements in.
All right. So I guess my closing statement is that I am worried about this story of commercial property collapsing from a long enough period of high interest rates. Although I do think interest rates are going to start coming down now. I think interest rates are about to start coming down. So I'll be okay. And I think, so I'm not super duper worried about, 3 more years of high interest rates. We may like the recession story depends on us reaching some sort of threshold or breaking point before the Fed can cut rates enough to save the commercial property market, after which the banking system suffers. And we all, sort of like suffer from that. I think this is possible. I'm not going to rule it out, but the 2010s taught me that long expansions don't die of old age, right? You don't need some special thing to keep pumping up the economy, or else it naturally crashes. The economy's natural state is to employ people. The economy's natural state is to work. A normal economy is an economy that's doing okay, not an economy that's crashing. And I think that people of the millennial generation, like us, I think you also are. I'm of the older millennial generation, but people of the millennial generation have a form of PTSD from the Great Recession, and then maybe from COVID, but especially from the Great Recession, where we just expect all expansions to end in tears, because when we were kids, when we were young, we saw that happen. We saw, everybody could see this housing bubble come, and there's this inevitable destruction that lasted for a decade. But I think that was unusual. That was weird. That we will someday have a recession like that again, but it may be a while. And I think that a lot of people are PTSD'd into thinking that expansions die of old age, and they just, and I don't think they really do. And I think that all those years I spent in the 2010s sort of expecting a recession to come and then not seeing it come have taught me a lesson. I don't want to overlearn that lesson, because I think a recession could come now, but I think I'm not going to sit around looking for today what's going to cause a recession, tomorrow what's going to cause a recession. I think a lot of finance and econ bloggers and writers I know, and asset managers too, played this game during the 2010s for years and years. And I think that and COVID came, but we never saw the economy just sort of collapse under its own weight from the 2010s expansion. And I'm not super confident that's going to happen again. I think there's a possibility we just keep chugging on without a big shock to derail us, because the economy's natural state is to do kind of okay.
Awesome. It's a good closing statement. I'll go to mine. I think the 2010s were actually the abnormal to the last 100 years or so. So I don't disagree with you that the economy overall expands and overall productivity growth happens just because people are more productive over time. There is this cumulative effect to technology and other things, and we're doing things a little bit better than the prior generation, and general prosperity and quality of life do tend to increase over time. However, having said that, this period of low interest rates that started in the early 1980s was very structural and lasted for a really long time. So it started in 1980s and then accelerated when LTCM was bailed out, and then this continuous level of government and really Fed intervention smoothed things out. And particularly post the global financial crisis, we went through a very unique period of time in the history of markets where we had this experiment with zero interest rates, and in some place negative interest rates, that caused massive debt accumulation and really the lowest volatility, the lowest financial volatility we've seen in 100 years. So yes, I don't disagree that generally speaking, things get better in the long run, but this type of everything is smooth is going to be fine without substantial amounts of volatility is actually not normal. So coming out of a period of very low rates where things were very easy, I think there's going to be a new equilibrium where there's just going to be a world with much more uncertainty and much more volatility. And frankly, it's going to be harder to make money investing the same way it was during the 2010s.
That's a great place to close. Thank you both for coming on the podcast, and thank you both for your tremendous patience through what has been difficult. Itay, we'll have to have you back on it at some point in a better Riverside situation, so that we can have a part two, because I think you guys.
This is only going to be This is going to be a 45-minute podcast once
Yeah,
we cut out all
yeah.
the
And
lag.
imagine if we went into geopolitics where we didn't even start doing that.
Next time. Jeez.
Yeah, next time. Guys, you both brought it today. It was really great. Thank you both for coming
Thanks
on.
so much. Thanks, Eric.
See you, man.